Welcome to this online lesson on protest and progress between 1964 and 1965, dying for the vote, the Freedom Summer, Selma, and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. There's going to be quite a lot of ground covered in this, so you will want to probably pause at various points and maybe take a break here and there. The aims are as follows: to know what the Civil Rights and Voting Acts were, to explain what led to changes in the law, and to evaluate the extent of change brought by changes in the law. Here's a do now task. To serve on a jury in a court case, you needed to be registered to vote. Firstly, why were so few black people able to be registered to vote? And secondly, what wider impact might this have on the civil rights struggle? Take a moment to consider these questions, and you can pause the video now. Right, it's worth remembering that the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was supposed to allow states to be prosecuted if they did not enforce the federal laws regarding voting rights and let black voters actually have the vote. Unfortunately, that law was a rather weak one because if any state was prosecuted for this, it would be decided by an all-white jury who would doubtless acquit their own state. So very few black voters were able to vote because of intimidation, because of rules that were brought in which made it very difficult for black voters to vote, and for extra procedures and bureaucratic nightmares that they had to go through in order to register to get the vote. Indeed, it was not unusual for people to turn up with completely correct documents and then just to be asked questions that were impossible to answer upon submitting their documents and then them being turned down. It was a completely deliberate system. So what wider impact could this have on the civil rights struggle? Well, bear in mind that all the racist violence against civil rights organisations were typically unpunished. Again, even if something could be brought to court, it was unlikely that a jury would acquit racists if they themselves shared similar views. So by sorting out this issue, it means that they'll be able to, first of all, better protect themselves. But there's actually a much wider issue here as well. By getting the right to vote, the government would have to listen to the civil rights protesters. They would have to, because if they didn't, they would not get the votes of those civil rights protesters and other black people in America. And so by getting the vote, it provides the need for the government to act on these people's behalf, otherwise they won't vote for them, otherwise they won't get into government. So it's a huge and important issue. First of all, though, some key words and terms. Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today comprises of: Act, in this particular context, meaning a law, a change to the law that is enacted by Congress. That's why it's called an act. Democrats, in the sense of the political party. This is the political party of both President Kennedy, who's on the left there, and President Johnson, who took over after Kennedy's assassination. Discrimination. This is a word that means to treat a group unfairly. Your tasks then, to give your own definition for the three key words, and then consider this key word which you may have encountered before. Dixiecrats in the South were Democrats who were against integration. How might Democrats in the North be different? Consider those answers, and just bear in mind that Dixie is a nickname for the South, and again, Democrats is the political party previously referred to. So pause the video while you complete those tasks, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Okay, this is a time in which the Democratic Party was actually quite split. The Dixiecrats in the South were very racist and they were against the idea of integration, whereas in the North, Democrats tended to be a whole lot more sympathetic to this. President Kennedy, for what it's worth, was of the mind that actually civil rights was a cause that was worth fighting for, and he agreed with many of the aims of people like Martin Luther King. However, it was difficult for him with so much opposition within his own party to do as much as he might have liked. Let's look at some of the first events. New subheading: The Freedom Summer of 1964. Take a look at the photographs first of all. At the top we can see a civil rights protester with a perfectly reasonable response: "Give us American rights." And next to him a racist counter-protester with quite the opposite idea. Underneath we can see a typical KKK ritual. This is the cross burning. These were highly visible events which were designed to intimidate people and let them know that this was Klan-controlled country in which black people and other enemies of the Ku Klux Klan could consider themselves in danger. It's worth remembering that the threats that the Ku Klux Klan gave out, they were more than capable and willing to carry out. Although black people registering to vote had gone up in some areas, in the Deep South black people were prevented from voting. What did SNCC and CORE do? In the election year of 1964, around 1,000, mostly white volunteer students from the north, went to the south to teach black people how to pass the voting registration tests. These were quite typical activities of SNCC and CORE. Remember that SNCC, the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, at this time had quite a broad membership which included many white supporters. So, first of all, as a task, sum up the events of the Freedom Summer under the headings of when, where, who, what happened and why. Then we got to consider the backlash. Mississippi's 10,000 Ku Klux Klan members saw this as an invasion. They intimidated the volunteers and black voters by burning 61 crosses across the state and burning 37 churches and 30 homes of black people. Also by beating up SNCC and CORE volunteers and potential voters. The second task then is to describe the actions of the KKK. As an extension, how typical is this of the reaction of Southern racists to civil rights campaigns? Compare it to another example. You can pause the video now and then press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, so let's have a look at the summary first of all. When was this? Well, it was in the summer of 1964, which happened also to be an election year. Where did it take place? Well, the main targeted states were the Deep South states where voting rates were at their lowest. Who was involved? SNCC and CORE, or the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality. What happened? 1,000 mostly white volunteer students helped black voters to register, but there was a significant white backlash. And why were they doing this? To help black voters register to vote in advance of the 1964 election. What about the actions of the KKK? Well, you've probably been able to identify those from the bullet points. Make sure you got those noted down at the very least. But how typical is this? The answer is actually quite typical. When you can compare this to the violent actions of the KKK in other events, you'll see this. For example, their attack on the Freedom Riders in 1961. All right, let's move on. June 1964, the Mississippi murders. When I said that the KKK were more than willing to carry out their threats, this is really what I'm referring to. On June the 21st, 2 white CORE volunteers, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, and 1 black volunteer, James Chaney, were arrested after an event. All of them were young students. They were released, but they never arrived home. Their burnt-out car was found 2 days later. The bodies of 8 black men, 3 of them CORE workers, were found soon after. Bearing in mind that most of these black bodies that were found were of people who hadn't even been reported as missing. This is how widespread the racism and murder was in Mississippi at this time. The white volunteers were found dead on August the 3rd. Your tasks then. First of all, in the description, I've added a link to a fairly recent news article that covers the legacy of these Mississippi murders. It's not easy to listen to or to watch, but it's worth seeing before you answer these questions, so give that some thought. What about the victims might have made these murders particularly shocking to Americans at the time? Of course, all of these murders are probably shocking to us now. Secondly, why might these events actually have helped the civil rights movement, even though it was at a tragic cost? So, watch that linked video and pause the video now while you complete the tasks. Alright, let's look at this first of all from the point of view of 1960s America. Unfortunately, 1960s America was very used to black activists being murdered. That was not something that hugely shocked people anymore, and it really should have done, but it just didn't, because it was so common. However, the murder of 2 middle-class white men, especially these students who were so idealistic, that did cause ripples throughout society. Now, to me, it does seem pretty tragic that it takes the death of 2 white men, as tragic as those deaths are, in order to bring attention to an issue that was actually an existing issue and that affected far more black people. But there we are. This is what it took in the society of 1960s America. So how did this potentially help the cause of civil rights? Well, it got people engaged with what they were doing, people became aware of what sacrifices they were putting on, and people became even more determined to ensure that black voters were able to exercise their democratic rights and go out and vote. Alright, once you feel like you've got enough details on the Mississippi murders, and bear in mind you might want to take some extra notes, then we'll move on. So, what did the Freedom Summer achieve? We're now going to have a look at some interpretations of the outcomes of the Freedom Summer. I've put these up as speech marks to show that they're the sort of opinions that people might hold, but they're not actually quotes by Martin Luther King or anyone else in this photograph. Firstly, after the Freedom Summer, 1,600 more black people had registered to vote in Mississippi. True, but that's out of 17,000 who tried to register, so clearly 90% of registrations still ended in failure. Sure, but the Freedom Summer made people aware of the problems people faced in trying to register to vote. Also true, but people were beaten up, lost their jobs, or were even murdered for standing up for their rights. Do you mostly agree with the arguments in blue or the arguments in red? You might want to note them down. Explain your choice in either respect. Based upon this, do you think the Freedom Summer was successful? Write a short point example explain paragraph to explain your point of view. Then lastly, compare the success of the Freedom Summer with either the sit-in campaigns of 1960 or Campaign C in Birmingham the year before in 1963. Pause the video now while you complete those tasks. Okay, your answers to this will largely be opinion-based, and so there's absolutely no need for me to go through what your opinions might be. However, that last one about the success of the Freedom Summer with either the sit-ins or Campaign C. Let's remember that the sit-in movement did spread across America, and it did have tangible benefits in terms of ending segregation in many public places. Campaign C, on the other hand, was what led to the March on Washington and really brought Martin Luther King to the fore. So, it's probably up there with something like Campaign C, but remember that the actual physical effects of getting more people to vote, or getting more black people registered to vote, was not entirely a success, as the statistics on this screen show. But one thing that it is linked to is this, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a really important act and one that you should write in your notes right away, nice and big. Go on, do it now. Now, no, I mean do it. Actually do it. No, bigger than that. Much bigger than that. Good. All right, that's about right. Okay, while you're finishing writing that down, you can pause the video. Good. Have I mentioned that this is really important? I think I have. Anyway, let's carry on. On the 2nd of July 1964, President Johnson, who was by then president, signed a law that banned discrimination in voter registration tests. Fantastic. That's exactly what the Freedom Summer was looking for. Ban discrimination in public spaces. Great, that would include desegregating all public spaces. And banned job discrimination and set up an Equal Opportunities Commission to enforce it. Also really positive. It also gave the government the power to force school desegregation. Can you then believe that by 1964, 10 years after Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, they are still having to do this? Well, they were, but this finally gave the federal government the power it needed. It also gave the government the right to remove federal funding from state projects that were seen to be discriminatory. Here's your task then. Firstly, record the changes brought in by the Civil Rights Act, you can see those on the left, and choose any two of those points. Explain how they would improve the lives of black Americans, assuming that they were enforced correctly. However, there was nothing in the law to enforce voter registration, and this is something of a loophole. Black people were afraid to complain to the Equal Opportunities Commission. There were few resources to enforce the law, and that meant that even though this was an election year of 1964, it would be really difficult for that particular part of the Civil Rights Act to have any effect. So, thirdly, what were the weaknesses of the Act? And fourthly, given the weaknesses, how important was the Act for civil rights? Explain your opinion using another point example explain. You can pause the video now and complete those answers. Alright, let's see. Firstly, have we recorded those changes? Hopefully. Hopefully you've also chosen those 2 points. I hope that you recognise that really what this is geared towards is ending segregation in public spaces, and so that would have a pretty big and daily impact upon black people's lives where they would not have to continue to live this segregated life. However, there are significant weaknesses with the Act. by not enforcing voter registration, it means that very few black people would actually get the vote from this compared to how they did earlier. And that means there would still be relatively little incentive for politicians, especially at a state level, to do anything about the rest of what the Civil Rights Act is asking for. So given that, you might well think that the Civil Rights Act is actually pretty unimportant. But it is a very important step on the way. Because as other laws come in, for example, the Voting Rights Act in the following year, there's going to be extra pressure on politicians to actually enact these things and get it done. And therefore it can be seen as a really important step in the right direction. That does bring us on to the issue of the voting rights, though. The March from Selma of 1965 is our next section. You might want to add this as a subheading. Firstly, you might get a bit of an impression as to what this event involves by looking at these photographs. Notice first of all the man being beaten by a police officer in the top picture. Others appear to be running away and other police are moving in. This relates to a particular event related to the March from Selma, which we'll come to in a moment. Underneath that, we can see a woman who's been beaten unconscious during this particular act of police brutality. The next target for the Southern Christian Leadership Council was voting rights in Alabama. SCLC was well established in Selma, Alabama, and Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy saw it as the next place where they could make a difference. A march was organised from Selma to Montgomery to highlight the lack of black voting rights that had been introduced by the Civil Rights Act the previous year. So, first of all, I need you to watch the video that I've linked, which tells us about the events surrounding the March from Selma. Then, I need you to describe the events of Bloody Sunday. Equally, there's another video that I've attached there which can give you the information that you need, and actually shows some of the original footage of that event. It's not nice to watch at all, but bear in mind this footage was actually shown on live TV around the country and was shocking then as well. What was the role of Martin Luther King in this campaign? And what was the role of President Johnson? You may want to do some further background reading to get the information for that. You can pause the video now while you watch those linked videos and answer those questions. Pause now. Okay, hopefully what we can see is that Martin Luther King did not take part in that first march because he'd been tipped off about the dangers and he'd hoped the rest of them would not go either. But about 300 black protesters did assemble on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It's worth remembering that Edmund Pettus, the man that the bridge is named after, was a KKK leader, which tells you everything you need to know about the local authorities, I think. Their passage to Montgomery was blocked at the other end of that bridge, not only by the police, but also by the sheriff and sheriff's deputies, many of whom were just local racist thugs who had been deputised that morning, given a badge, and allowed to go attack people. At a given signal, tear gas was fired, horses charged in, bullwhips cracked, and truncheons smacked people. It's almost a miracle that no one was killed that day, but there were a number of really serious injuries, so that event became known as Bloody Sunday on March the 7th of 1965. Okay, once we've got all the information that we need from that, we'll move on. Okay, another key law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Get this one written down nice and big as well, at least as big as how you wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1964. At least as big. Alright, pause the video, get it down now. It's really important. Okay, this one is really important as well, as I say, so let's make sure that we've got all the right details. So all of that violence in Selma and the campaigning and the publicity that gained eventually resulted in President Johnson passing an act which basically closed up the loopholes of the Civil Rights Act of the year before. On August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act added extra safeguards to the Civil Rights Act. One, voting registration requirements enforced by the federal government, so those loopholes could now be closed. States could set up voter qualification rules, but only with federal approval, so any states that tried to introduce any discriminatory voter registration tests, etc., would find the federal government preventing them from doing so. And federal officials ran voting registration in any state and in all states where under 50% of voters were registered to vote. So if there was an area with a large number of black voters who were unable to register, i.e. those with under 50% of voters registered, that is where the federal government would step in to ensure that no one was being prevented from registering to vote. So important stuff. And remember, it's the right to vote that puts pressure on the politicians. So your tasks. Record the changes brought in by the Voting Rights Act. Then choose 2 points and explain how they would improve the lives of black Americans. Again, we're now looking at it in a more tangential side-on view, where we're not imagining the day-to-day changes, but how this allows them to have a democratic and political voice. So that's a little bit more tricky than the similar task you did earlier with the Civil Rights Act. People who were registered to vote could also serve on juries, remember. So explain why being able to serve on a jury was also important in the wider civil rights struggle. Pause the video now while you complete those tasks. Alright, hopefully we've identified the improvements and the main terms. So why was serving on a jury so important? Well, this meant that there would be fewer unpunished murders of black people in the Deep South, given that black people could now serve on juries as well. It was going to be a tricky sort of situation to handle, and it was going to be difficult to get local judges, etc., to stop being so racist, but this was a really important step in the right direction. It also meant that civil rights protesters who were being treated unfairly under the law would now have better protection if they were accused of a crime. Finally, why was all this necessary? Well, consider the change within a year, from 1964 through to 1965. All of the rights granted in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were already in the US Constitution. In a very real sense, they were nothing new. All they were acts to ensure that the Constitution itself was upheld. Remember, that amendment of the Constitution which stated that all people had equal protection under the law. Well, now the federal government was doing something to ensure that states listened to that. Firstly, explain why the acts were still necessary to secure rights for black people, regardless of what it said in the US Constitution. Secondly, give one thing that each act did for black civil rights. And then thirdly, why might black people still have felt some frustration? That last one really will require some thought, so pause the video now and allow yourself time to do that. Well, quite simply for question 1, these were still necessary because many states were ignoring the black people's rights under the Constitution, and so it needed to be made explicit. So, what did each act do for civil rights? Well, for one thing, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really spells the end of segregation, especially segregation that's backed by a legal framework. And the Voting Rights Act allows black people the opportunity to vote and therefore have a say in future elections. It's no surprise that the sheriff who was involved in the attack on the Edmund Pettus Bridge was never elected to office again. Thirdly, why might black people have still felt frustration at this? Well, these are all political changes and changes to their rights. But would that change the attitudes of Southern racists? The answer, simply, is no, not immediately. And also, would this improve their living conditions? Many black people, having suffered years of discrimination both in the workplace as well as wider society, lived in very impoverished communities. These acts would do nothing to improve their circumstances, at least in the short term. And so there was still plenty of frustration to be felt. We're going to spend some time now considering the differences and similarities between Kennedy and Johnson in terms of their attitudes to civil rights. Let's look at John F. Kennedy first of all. He was president between 1961 and 1963. He appointed black people to high-level jobs. For example, NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the courts and Robert Weaver was in his government. He pressed for new laws, but he was assassinated before any of them could be passed. And he used executive orders to support civil rights, e.g. sending troops to Ole Miss to support James Meredith. He also requested escorts to protect the Freedom Riders, again to ensure that they wouldn't be attacked in the same way that they had been at Anniston. What about Johnson then? Lyndon B. Johnson was president between 1963 and 1969. He also appointed black people to high-level jobs. Indeed, Thurgood Marshall joined the Supreme Court as the first ever African-American Supreme Court Justice. And Patricia Harris became an ambassador under his government, the first African-American woman to be appointed to that role. He also passed the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He used extensive executive orders to support civil rights, and he made the Alabama National Guard escort the marchers from Selma to Montgomery. Normally, the National Guard was more often under the command of the state governor. But given that George Wallace, the then state governor, was absolutely opposed to the march, Johnson stepped in. He also put pressure on Southern politicians like George Wallace to support the Civil Rights Act. Tasks then. In what ways were Kennedy's and Johnson's approaches to civil rights similar? Put my teeth back in. In what ways were Kennedy's and Johnson's approaches to civil rights different? And in your opinion, who did more to help the civil rights movement and give black people the vote? Explain using point, example, explain. Take some time to answer those questions now, so you can pause the video. Okay, both are similar in the sense that they were in favour of passing legislation, although of course only one actually got to do it. They were both similar in the sense that they wanted to appoint black people to high-level positions, and they were both prepared to use executive orders to send in the troops where necessary. One of the crucial differences, though, is that perhaps because he was president for so much longer, Johnson was able to develop or devote more of his energies to trying to get those Dixiecrat politicians on his side and on the side of civil rights, which must have been a heck of a task. Not only that, but Johnson was actually able to pass legislation, although of course we will never know whether Kennedy was able to do that or not. So who did more to help civil rights? Well, I'll leave that up to you. But it is worth bearing in mind that Kennedy got the ball rolling, but arguably Johnson finished the job, at least from the point of view of passing legislation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that had an immediate impact on improving lives. So, in summary, the SCLC and Martin Luther King got publicity for the protests that they joined, such as at Selma. The civil rights movement provoked a violent reaction from some white people in Birmingham. President Kennedy's call for a civil rights bill, and the size of the crowds in the March of Washington showed the importance of civil rights issues, and Martin Luther King's speech made him a leader for the civil rights struggle. But let's see if we can rewrite this paragraph including these connectives, and so, which, led to, and later. That will provide you with a grammatically correct summary of these events. Have a go at doing that now. It should only be about a 3 or 4 minute task. So this is how it should read. The SCLC and Martin Luther King got publicity for the protests they joined, so the civil rights movement provoked a violent reaction from some white people in Birmingham, which led to President Kennedy's call for a civil rights bill. Later, the size of crowds in the March on Washington showed the importance of civil rights issues, and Martin Luther King's speech made him a leader of the civil rights struggle. Or, if you'd prefer, we can write a summary by way of a diagram, like this one. Let's consider some of the legal gains for black Americans since 1954. Firstly, we have Supreme Court desegregation laws, such as the Brown v. Board of Education case and Browder v. Gale in 1956. Some effects of this included desegregation, but often new rules were created that enforced unofficial segregation. This might also lead to school closures, as it did at Little Rock, and federally enforced desegregation, where the government would need to act directly to ensure desegregation was being carried out. This often led to white resentment and a violent backlash. On the other hand, there were civil rights and the Voting Rights Acts. Some effects of those were that new rules applied, but rules could be ignored unless enforced by federal officials, and also there was white resentment to these changes too. But in 1965, as in 1954, many black Americans faced discrimination in housing, work, education, medical care and treatment by the police. These legal gains did virtually nothing to overturn these, especially in the short term. And also many black Americans were pushing for their legal rights. They faced racist violence if they did so. They also needed the help of federal troops if they were standing up for their rights. They were often not accepted and were treated as second-class citizens in 1965 as they had been in the 50s. This meant that they would lose self-esteem as well. The end result of this is, despite the very significant legal gains by 1965, such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, many black protesters were beginning to feel quite disillusioned with the civil rights movement. They saw that progress was happening at a painfully slow rate, and they felt very little actual progress in their quality of life. And so, if the tactics that had been used so far were not believed to be working, some of these protesters would change tactics, and that will be the subject of what we look at next. So, take down this diagram if you think it would be helpful, but other than that, I'll say thank you very much. I hope this has been useful, and if it has been, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye.